All right, let's just jump right in. If you're starting a nonprofit, you have definitely heard the word bylaws. And let's be honest, it sounds like a bunch of boring legal paperwork, right? Something you just have to power through. But here's the thing. Your bylaws aren't just paperwork. They are the literal blueprint for your organization's success or its failure.
So how are we going to build this blueprint? Well, first, we're going to talk about the #1 mistake I see founders make. That's the template trap. Then, we'll get into what bylaws really are. We'll also cover why the IRS, of all people, is so interested in them. After that, I'm going to give you a super practical checklist of what you need to include. And finally, we'll put it all together so you can walk away knowing how to create a rock-solid foundation for your nonprofit.
Okay, let's start with the biggest, most common pitfall out there. It's so tempting, it's so easy, but man, it can cause a world of hurt down the road. I'm talking about the generic template trap.
So, be honest with me for a second. Does this sound familiar? You did a quick Google search, you found a free template, and you thought, awesome, one less thing to worry about. You know what? We've all been there. But this right here, this is where the trouble starts.
So why is this such a big deal? Think about it this way. A generic template is like one of those prefab houses. It might look okay from the outside, but it wasn't built for your specific needs. It probably doesn't comply with your local laws, like the California Nonprofit Corporation Code, for example, and even more importantly, it's not designed for how you actually plan to operate. You're left with something that's not just a bad fit, it's potentially unstable.
Okay, so if bylaws aren't just some boilerplate text you can copy and paste, then what in the world are they? This brings us to their real purpose. They aren't just a list of rules, they are your organization's core operational guide.
So let's get crystal clear. What are bylaws? At their heart, they're the internal rules that spell out how your nonprofit works, day in and day out. The absolute best way to think about them is as your organization's operating manual. Seriously. This is the manual your board turns to when they need to make decisions or figure out who has authority to do what. Without it, everybody's just kind of flying blind.
Now, this is a super common point of confusion, so let's clear it up right now. Your Articles of Incorporation, that's the public document you file with the state to legally create your nonprofit. Your bylaws, on the other hand, are the internal document that defines how you operate. So put it this way. The articles create the body of your nonprofit, but the bylaws provide its nervous system. They're the internal wiring that dictates how it moves, reacts, and makes every single decision.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, it's an internal operating manual, so who cares besides us? Well, there is one very, very important external audience that cares a whole lot, and that's the IRS.
And here's the bottom line. You cannot get your 501c3 tax-exempt status without submitting your bylaws. It's not optional. They are a required part of your application. An IRS reviewer is going to read them word for word, and if they see weak or generic or just problematic rules, your application could be delayed for months, or worse, denied completely.
So what is the IRS actually looking for when they're reading these? Well, they're looking for red flags. They want to see real board independence, not a situation where the founder just appointed their friends and family to rubber stamp every decision. They are looking for a strong conflict of interest policy to prevent people from enriching themselves. They need to see in black and white that no profits can go to private individuals. And they want to see democratic processes that prevent any one person from having absolute unchecked power. Your bylaws are where you prove you have all of this covered.
All right, we've talked about the problems and we've talked about the stakes. So, what actually goes into a solid set of bylaws? Let's switch gears and get into the solution. It's time to break down the essential checklist. First things first, the fundamentals of your board. You've got to define its size and make sure you know your state's minimum requirements. This is key for getting enough diverse perspectives in the room. You also need to spell out how long directors serve. 2 or 3 years is pretty common, and if their terms are staggered. Staggered terms are a fantastic way to keep some continuity and avoid having the entire leadership team leave all at once. And finally, you have to state how often you'll meet and what a quorum is. You know, how many people need to be present to actually make a decision.
Next up, let's talk about people and their roles. Your bylaws absolutely must define officer positions like president, secretary, and treasurer, and spell out exactly what they're responsible for. This gets rid of any confusion about who can sign a check or who can enter into a contract. If you're going to have committees, their powers need to be clear too. And this is a big one. If you have paid staff, like an executive director, it's critical to define that relationship and make it clear that the board has the ultimate oversight.
And finally, we get to the real nitty-gritty, policies and procedures. A strong conflict of interest section, that's totally non-negotiable for the IRS.
You also need to lay out your financial processes, stuff like your fiscal year and how you approve the budget. This is all about transparency and accountability. You also need a section that explains how the bylaws themselves can be changed. You don't want this to be too easy, otherwise your whole structure could be in constant chaos. And lastly, you must have a dissolution plan, which confirms that if you ever shut down, your assets will go to another charity. This is a huge part of maintaining public trust.
So, we have our checklist. We have all the parts. But how do you take these pieces and turn them into a living, breathing document that actually makes your nonprofit stronger? Let's build that final blueprint.
So, how do you actually do this? It's really not that scary. Here's a simple 6-step process. First, assess your real needs. A tiny, all-volunteer group doesn't need the same rules as a huge national organization. Then, design a structure that actually fits you. After that, you draft the provisions, customizing every single section to match your reality. Step 4 is critical. Verify that you're in compliance with your state's laws. Then the board has to formally vote to adopt them. And finally, and this is important, don't just file them away and forget them. Document the adoption and plan to review them every few years to make sure they still make sense.
You know, when you really think about it, this whole thing comes down to one key idea. And it's summed up perfectly here. Bylaws aren't just boilerplate you copy and forget. They are the active foundation for everything that you do. They're what get you approved by the IRS. They guide your board when things get tough, and they give funders the confidence to invest in your mission.
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. When you really look at your organization, are your bylaws a source of strength, clarity, and stability? Or are they a generic, forgotten document, a hidden fault line just waiting for something to go wrong? The answer to that question is going to define your nonprofit's future.